And this comes from my acquaintance with this particular group, comes from my experience as a geography lecturer, when I was teaching rural development in the Third World and village level change and things like that, and sort of integrated development involving the various aspects of basically trying to lift levels of poverty and exploitation in rural parts of the non-Western world. And I wrote away to a group called World Vision. And World Vision sent me a very large package of extremely interesting, well-illustrated multimedia presentation about village-level development. And it all seemed very credible, and it seemed that World Vision was doing a great deal. And I was very impressed at that time. I started looking at things a little bit more deeply, and the theme of this talk basically is that things aren't what they seem. And if I could just give you an example of this one agency and an insight into my learning process. Now, World Vision basically helps children in poor countries deal with poverty by getting millions of ordinary people to donate money to a sponsorship program. But, well, World Vision began in Korea around 1950 as a Youth for Christ organization, backed by Billy Graham. World Vision became the main evangelical intelligence gathering agency with the establishment of Missions Advanced Research and Communications, MARC, in 1967. World Vision is a sister organization, that's the official term, a sister organization of the family, or the Fellowship Foundation, a secretive political elite in Washington, D.C. World Vision's one-time chairman of the board, John Hinckley Sr., was an oil man whose company was bailed out by George H.W. Bush, another oil man. World Vision worker John Hinckley Jr., John Hinckley Sr.'s son, shot and nearly killed Ronald Reagan. World Vision worker Mark Chapman shot and killed John Lennon. World Vision cooperated extensively with the CIA during the Vietnam War while it was managing the refugee population. World Vision helped settle Hmong refugees from Laos in the late Jim Jones settlement in Jonesville, or Jonestown rather, Guyana. World Vision also managed Honduran and Cuban refugee camps where pro-US fighters were trained in the 80s under Reagan. World Vision helped manage the Sabra and Shatila camps in Lebanon. World Vision is closely involved with the highest levels of the US government and reports regularly to the US Congress. World Vision's president, Robert Seipel, became the United States' first ambassador for international religious freedom under the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act passed by the US Congress. World Vision took control of humanitarian operations in northern Iraq on behalf of the State Department from 2003 to 2006 on a $30 million contract. World Vision, through its Institute for Global Engagement spin-off, negotiated Vietnam's entry into the World Trade Organization on behalf of the State Department. World Vision, through its International Justice Mission spin-off, acts as human rights enforcer for the State Department. World Vision's annual budget, at about $2 billion, is equivalent to the United Nations budget. World Vision is the largest handler of food aid, or the largest shipper of food aid in the world. And World Vision works closely with Chevron, GM, Nike, Barrick Gold of Canada, Hasbro Toys, and more than 200 other corporate partners in its aid programs. So things aren't quite what they seem. Now, in my book, the one mentioned by Muhyiddin, I argue that since World War II, there has been a sustained project in the US to incorporate the evangelical movement into government, in particular as a force in foreign affairs. Now, this project has been at the behest of secular interests, both corporate and political, and has been driven by both the need for capitalism to expand and the passion of an evangelical minority of United States Protestants, particularly Baptists and Pentecostalists, both which are strongly American forms of Christianity. The organization of the project involved a handful of secretive elite groups, such as the Fellowship Foundation and the Fellowship of the Burning Heart, which is a fellowship basically concerned with evangelization of schools in the United States, ostensibly begun by Henrietta Mears. Also by the CIA and the State Department. A number of United States presidents, including Reagan and the two Bushes. A lengthy program of debate and reorganization known as the Lausanne Movement from 1974 onwards. And many hundreds of evangelical agencies, especially in the early stages, those centered on Billy Graham. Now, much of the planning was in secret. One of the main tasks of the project was to repackage Western evangelization for a post-colonial world by making Christianization more culturally contextualized, but still a faithful surrogate of Westernization. And by establishing a global structure of management and control for church planting and church growth. More generally, the task was to modernize Christianity as a tool of imperial control. To meet this task and to more formally integrate the secular and the religious, a number of things had to be done, and if I could just itemize them, basically 6. Firstly, the corporate, military, and political elites had to be connected more closely to the leaders of the church. This was done through groups, as I said, like the family, but also by groups like the Council for National Policy, the National Prayer Committee, Heritage Foundation, and so on. Secondly, the ideological, theological support needed refining. Dominionism and spiritual warfare emerged as the two theological, and I would put theological in inverted commas, the two theological legs of evangelization. The first, dominionism, was largely from Fuller College or Fuller Theological Seminary. The second, associated especially with C. Peter Wagner, who I'll come back to later on. On top of this, Peter Drucker, who was a General Motors management expert, Peter Drucker's three-legged stool, again, which I'll mention a bit later, and Yonggi Cho's cell church theory were key management aids for the movement. Thirdly, a global prayer network was needed for the use of prayer as a code, as a weapon, and as a call to arms. A number of key computerized prayer networks were developed, especially by Campus Crusade for Christ and groups associated with Campus Crusade for Christ, which began around the same time that World Vision began, by the way, and also by C. Peter Wagner's World Prayer Center in Colorado. Fourthly, and related to this, a global evangelical intelligence network was needed, especially for cultural, religious, and political data, to allow the penetration of something like 4,000 ethno-linguistic groups in the non-Western world. And also to facilitate the strategic use of prayer against the devil's territories for the purposes of spiritual warfare and better missionizing. Now, this involved, to some extent, co-opting academe, especially the social sciences, and especially, obviously, anthropology in a number of colleges, and bringing a lot of Christian anthropologists, Christian social scientists, or rather evangelical academics into seminaries such as Fuller College, but also Eastern Baptist College and there are many others. It also involved liaising fairly closely with the CIA, as, for example, in the work they did in India. It involved focusing missionaries on data collection and connecting the Christian computer network. The Joshua Project, and you can key that very simply on the internet. The Joshua Project is a good example of this. Fifthly, a network for providing material infrastructure had to be coordinated, especially in the realms of corporate funding, and a big Christian fund management industry developed over the last 20 years or so. Bible translation and publishing, Wycliffe Bible translators, Summer Institute of Linguistics, people like this, many of them such as Summer Institute of Linguistics funded by the oil industry, in particular people like Norman Hunt. IT, information technology, and aviation too. The evangelical movement as a whole has something like 600 airplanes. They have about 400 million Christian, again in inverted commas, Christian computers available. And they have something like $400 billion in liquid assets. And finally, the sixth point, or the sixth need, the sixth requirement that needed to be fulfilled, there was needed a comprehensive proxy presence in the non-Western world of non-white, cross-cultural missionaries from Latin America, from India. And India in particular was notable for this because when Indira Gandhi banned the missionaries, I think it was 77 or thereabouts, India was then used by outside agencies to develop its own evangelical base, and many tens of thousands of Indian missionaries went overseas, many to US. Korea, obviously, and Southeast Asia. Korea partly because the Campus Crusade for Christ went in fairly early after the Korean War and developed a very strong evangelical presence there. The evangelical percentage of the population went up from 3%, something like that, to 26% by 2000. And to use these, especially in the Muslim world, great emphasis then was laid on indigenizing the fieldwork of evangelization while keeping the management under strict Western control. Now, the Lausanne movement, as I say, began in about 74 officially, but various agencies around Billy Graham had been planning it since the mid-60s, and they'd been holding preliminary consultations and so on in places like Berlin, 66, 68, and so on. It was essentially a process of consultation and policy making involving all of the West's main evangelical bodies, like the Evangelical Association and so on, NEA, or National Association of Evangelicals, NAE, and groups like that, hammering out a response to the post-colonial assertiveness of the non-Western world. The next 30 years or so saw the maturing of the evangelical project in every respect. In particular, there evolved a kind of dual-track system of conducting foreign policy. A global evangelical network, Protestant-inspired, well-resourced, tightly organized, and strategically very focused, interacting with the secular forces of expansion, cultural forces, forces of westernization of the media and so on, economic forces, especially the corporate sector and big corporations, the political, obviously, and the military. And the military was especially targeted. So that you now have in the US military something like 40-45% of all chaplains are now evangelical. And this interaction immeasurably strengthened the influence of all groups in the coalition of power. The net result then has been a significant reinforcing of US cultural influence in the non-Western world, a more effective spread of US-style free enterprise economics, partly through the prosperity gospeling of the Pentecostals, but also through the activities of groups like World Vision. Very mainstream, very respectable, but promoting a particular view of economic development. The strengthening of pro-American political elites and middle classes, a reduction in the threat of peasant-based revolution and of liberation theology, especially in Latin America, a powerful evangelical presence in numerous strategic border areas of the non-Western world, Africa, border areas like the southern Sudan, Uganda nexus, Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the buffer states between India and China. Nagaland, incidentally, is the most Baptist state in the world, more Baptist than Tennessee. And key countries such as Guatemala, which now again has about 30% evangelical population, Brazil, Uganda, Sudan, Indonesia, South Korea, and so on. In addition, there's been a substantial church cooperation in fighting wars in Central America, in Indochina, in Central Africa, and in the Middle East. Besides, the political position of Israel in the non-Western world has been immeasurably strengthened, because this is ultimately a Christian Zionist project. It is not just evangelical Christian. And the conflict between the West and the Muslim world has been given significant impetus. Of course, secular changes of various kinds had their own reinforcing impact. The increased Western control of the UN, for example, and its specialist agencies, accompanied the trend towards using more and more non-UN NGOs, in, especially mission agencies, in relief and development work, in food aid, in other variously humanitarian and human rights programs. And other factors which put wind in the sails of the evangelicals were the '67 war between Israel and its neighbors, the OPEC shock, the defeat in Vietnam, and the rise of information technology. Now, the core dominionist idea that I mentioned earlier is basically that of incarnating the Holy Spirit on earth and incarnating it in the body of the church. And by doing this, of capturing every nation in the world in fulfillment of Christ's Great Commission, which is mentioned probably mostly in the book of Matthew. Now, this dominionist idea is in perfect harmony with the secular needs of empire for three reasons. Firstly, dominionists argue that pursuit of the Great Commission, of Christ's Great Commission, requires the church to act decisively in worldly affairs. In other words, as a secular agent of God. Secondly, they espouse a theology that is effectively scriptural code for the American way. Thirdly, they insist that evangelization must transform not individuals, not person by person, but should transform entire nations, cultures, societies as wholes, as integral organisms, thus requiring comprehensive Christianization of the entire social and political system of a country, and not just of individuals. Now, this is a key requirement. It means that evangelization of a country must involve a large number of agencies, penetrating every sector of interest and influence, wearing a great variety of secular cloaks, and collectively strongly managed from an outside network. But the evangelicals bring to the project four very special dimensions. Firstly, they bless what is often a ruthlessly secular penetration with the balm of biblical support and Christian humanitarianism, thereby, through that blessing, benefiting the three other members of the ruling coalition. Obviously, it pays as a corporation working in the mining industry of the Andes to have Christ's blessing. The blessing of the other two sectors of the coalition, or the secular sector, the secular parts of the coalition, is very much one of the key justifications of the three-legged stool model. Now, we've heard in a number of contexts about the increasing importance of civil society, and this is a phrase which is very, very postmodernist, civil society, arising in terms of a proliferation of NGO-type organizations doing basically what used to be done by, say, the United Nations or by government and so on. What Drucker's three-legged stool version of this basically meant was that the church would take over the civil society element quite strongly. Drucker himself was a strong Presbyterian, and he was very strongly Christian in his formulation of management theory. Secondly, the second dimension that the evangelicals brought was by undermining the religion of a culture, of a society. They seeked to capture the very soul of that community or that culture, thereby disabling it as a resistant force. Now this is important. I mean, we can use the word soul very glibly, but in any culture there is an essence, there is a soul which is absolutely fundamental and which is not necessarily material. This is what the evangelicals went for. And at the most crucial and the most sensitive point, not so much diet, not so much language, faith. And thirdly, in very literal terms, the evangelicals demonize their opponents, demonize the opponents of imperialism, thus validating the secular expansion as holy war. Now, if this sounds tough, there's worse to come. To be, as a war to be fought against the devil through prayer and through spiritual warfare, as well as through the forces of economics or politics or military force or whatever. This use of spiritual warfare, this use of prayer, was absolutely fundamental, and it was fundamental to the entire structure, literal structure, of the evangelical movement. And fourthly, the fourth dimension that was provided strongly by the evangelical movement, they provided a very powerful framework for the management and control of subject people. A framework in which prayer, to a large extent, is a proxy for political power. Now, at these and many levels, the secular and the religious seeg into one another. They blend into one another. In many ways, it's extremely complex and extremely difficult to articulate, but there'll be one or two examples later on which hopefully will explain just what I mean. For dominionists, the divine must be secular. And so the secular, properly focused, is divine. In other words, to achieve Christ's Great Commission, one must do all that is necessary to achieve secular power. And for the imperialists themselves, this conflation of theology and economic greed gives a passion to the task. But for targeted countries, the interplay of the secular and religious, constructed and often obscured as imperial policy, is both a challenge to comprehension and a serious political and cultural threat. Now, if we could look just briefly at the agencies that I'm talking about, the agencies of evangelization. For the target country, this kind of twin-barreled penetration is extremely hard to resist. We need only look at the variety of groups which routinely penetrate target societies. Now, maintaining an official presence, more often than not, and we're talking primarily here about non-Muslim countries, but in many partly or minority Muslim countries, the same group of agencies are present. World Vision, including the Institute for Global Engagement and International Justice Mission, they're usually there. But then so too, in many, many countries, is the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship, and Youth for Christ, and InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and Youth with a Mission is particularly strong, Campus Crusade for Christ, Haggai International, which is a leadership training group based in Singapore, which began in Singapore, which is heavily funded by what used to be known as Blackwater. In fact, Haggai is a very interesting group, because it's originally from West Michigan, and it's been funded quite strongly by West Michigan people like the DeVos people, the Amway family, Van Andels, and of course Prince, Eric Prince being the founder and director of Blackwater Security. Also Equip, EQUIP, which I'll mention later on. The Assemblies of God are particularly important because they merge into a number of groups like Campus Crusade for Christ, World Youth with a Mission, Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship, and so on. The Assemblies of God are particularly aggressive evangelical church. The International Coalition of Apostles, which I'll come to in a moment, Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, which are linked. Samaritan's Purse, incidentally, was a spin-off from World Vision. The original founder of World Vision got a bit fed up with the way things were going and left it and started Samaritan's Purse. Now, Samaritan's Purse, which is now run by Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, is one of the most vitriolically anti-Muslim agencies that there is. Then there are a number of other things like Habitat for Humanity. Well, Habitat for Humanity is again like World Vision, very similar to World Vision. Teen Challenge, Global Mapping, which is an infrastructural agency which is concerned very much with mapping the territories of the devil so that prayer warfare can take place. Mission Aviation Fellowship, Jungle Aviation and Radio System, these are all infrastructural groups which are very often around Southeast Asia and were, for example, helping out in Indonesia during the early transmigration period, which was certainly in Indochina during the war. Now, some of these agencies, like World Vision or Habitat for Humanity, are ostensibly relief and development agencies, whose brief does not include missionizing. Others, like Youth for Christ and InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, are explicitly Christian groups. The problem arises because while all these agencies operate overtly, they also work to some extent covertly as evangelists in more sensitive areas. And it is usually very difficult to uncover the deceit. Youth with a Mission, for example, present in all Southeast Asian countries, is a good example of a mission with many cloaks. Youth with the Mission was involved in setting up one of the hostels for the Fellowship Foundation in Washington. Youth with the Mission, through its the Film Institute, which is a David Horowitz associated group, was involved in a propaganda film called The Path to 9/11, which sought to discredit the Clinton administration over the handling of that, and so on. So there's more to Youth with a Mission than just what they do in northern Thailand, which is basically deracinate children, local children, detribalize local children by putting them in children's homes. There's a lot of this going on in Thailand. Youth with a Mission plays a key role in sanitizing these areas. They've got a fairly large web of children's and women's havens, which are justified as responses to tribal poverty and tribal immorality. The Akar people are a case in point. The Akar are about 70 villages around the Burma-Thai border, and they've been very heavily missionized by Youth with a Mission in its house, Eden House, and a number of other children's homes. But then there are those who are present in an unofficial capacity as covert evangelists, and these include many missions which are specifically directed at Muslims. A large number of Youth with a Mission affiliates, including their numerous Muslim missions, Baptist, Pentecostal, Mormon, and other tent makers in all humanitarian sectors, especially those involved with women and children and the sick. And also people who evangelize in the guise of leadership and motivational gurus. And there is a big industry of Christian or evangelical leadership gurus. Os Hillman, Zig Ziglar, John Calvin Maxwell, people like that. Paul Mayer. They sell millions and millions and millions of books, these people. And sometimes they don't mention the Bible at all. In a particular case, John Calvin Maxwell, I'll come to in a minute. Also, short-term mission tourists, including students and migrant workers. They are often used as a cover for missionizing. Now, this diversity of different agencies is crucial for the entire operation. And it's one of the biggest problems for the target country. There's a strong division of function, allowing both specialization and this is crucial, a high degree of plausible deniability. But although there's a strong division of function, the whole is indivisible. So, to take the examples just mentioned from a single country, World Vision provides rural development aid, usually in partnership with the World Bank and USAID, and also private corporations. And through its Vision Fund International, which is another spin-off, it extends microcredit facilities. World Vision subsidiary, IGE, Institute of Global Engagement, lobbies for freer access for US products, and it lobbies also for religious freedom. The International Justice Mission helps to police human trafficking, so-called human trafficking on the borders, and it monitors human rights, especially those of women and children. And the point about International Justice Mission, just like IGE, is that it is used as part of the American sanctions system. So every year there is a report on human rights and on religious freedom in every country in the world. And if you don't score a certain number of points, you will be denied trade access. You will not be given World Trade Organization membership. You will not get this, that, or the other kind of concession. Now, this is quite open. This has been done under a US Congress law, which I've mentioned already, and it is being run by World Vision and its affiliates as members essentially of the US State Department. So while this is going on, World Vision's Office of Prayer Mobilization liaises with the Global Prayer Network to direct prayer warfare. The Full Gospel Businessman's Fellowship mobilizes evangelical city businessmen in a network of prayer come political cells. And, well, we could go on and on and on. There are so many of them. And it's a vast diversity. All these groups interact. They all need one another, and they are all tightly linked into global networks of inspiration, into global networks of computerized intelligence and prayer, and infrastructural facilities, funding and management, and so on. There are denominational differences, and obviously Baptists and Pentecostalists in many ways don't get on. But when it comes to evangelizing the non-Western world, these differences are very often forgotten. And say the Assemblies of God and the Presbyterian Church and the Baptists are hard at work cooperating in southern Sudan. I mean, the stakes are high enough for all of them to get together and cooperate. So, and there are a number of cases which I could give you later. Well, yeah, I could mention southern Sudan later. So, a summary then of the effects of evangelization. But let me, I think probably before I do, can I just give you another example? And I think this is a very poignant example. It's a Pentecostal example. Now, some aspects of Pentecostalism and charismatic Christianity are seen to be especially appropriate for non-Western evangelization, given indigenous spiritual traditions, given the economic security of ethnic minority economic group, ethnic minority middle classes, and so on. For example, faith healing, the prosperity gospel, things like this, which are associated with the Pentecostal movement quite strongly. And a reflection of the appeal of these, and also a reflection of the aggressiveness of pushing Pentecostalism, can be seen in the statistics. Between 1970 and 2010, the percentage of world Christians who were Pentecostal charismatic rose from 6% to 28%. Now, let me give you just one example of one of the networks. The International Coalition of Apostles was begun in Singapore by a chap called, it had its first meeting in Singapore at least, by a chap called C. Peter Wagner. Now, C. Peter Wagner he calls himself a charismatic. He is the chief apostle. So, firstly there is God, and then there is C. Peter Wagner. Then there is an apostolic council of prophetic elders. And this is a 30-member or thereabouts inner sanctum. It's led by C. Peter Wagner, the chief apostle, and Chuck Pierce as chief prophet. This Council of Prophetic Elders basically runs a very big network of some 500 apostles worldwide. And these 500 apostles represent about 350 agencies, evangelizing agencies. They're basically assemblies of God and other Pentecostal charismatic churches based in the United States. They have affiliates in 40 countries, connections to most others. Their ideology is dominionist. It's strongly in support of spiritual warfare, the prosperity gospel. It's strongly pro-US, Christian Zionist, and anti-Islam. Their key functions are a number. Firstly, grooming Christian leaders in business, politics, and military through pseudo-secular fronts, especially leadership gurus like Oz Hillman and John Calvin Maxwell. Evangelical leadership networks like the Million Leaders Mandate, Second Billion Network, Christian Men's Network, and so on. And also major mission groups like the Full Gospel People, Campus Crusade, and Youth with a Mission. Secondly, their function is that of promoting and coordinating spiritual warfare through prayer networks. One of the main prayer networks was itself founded by C. Peter Wagner in Colorado, the World Prayer Center. There was an article I read some time ago which said if, how did they put it? If the World Prayer Center is Operation Desert Storm, then C. Peter Wagner is Norman Schwarzkopf. There are many other prayer networks. The Fellowship Foundation itself is a prayer network which is basically concerned with using this secretive network in Washington to project the ideal of a Christian republic in Christian expansion in search of a Christian empire. And this basically is how the Fellowship Foundation presents itself. However, it will meet all sorts of people who may be useful to the cause. President Suharto, for example, Tony Blair, Bono, all sorts of people go and attend the prayer breakfast. Thirdly, the ICA, the International Coalition of Apostles, is concerned quite explicitly with promoting US-style capitalism, especially through prosperity gospeling. Fourthly, it promotes US military dominance, and it does so in a particular way. It promotes the hegemony of the United States as hegemony over the devil and its principalities. In particular, opposing Islam and military power and Muslim power of any kind. And the military side of things are under the control of groups like Campus Crusade for Christ's Military Ministry, Christian Embassy, things like that. Fifthly, the ICA, the International Coalition of Apostles, is concerned with promoting the cause of Christian Zionism in the non-Western world, especially amongst non-Muslim minorities in largely Muslim countries, such as Southeast Asia. And an example of this would be Pastor Alex Tanasuputra's Bethany Church in Surabaya, which is one of the largest churches in Asia, 25,000 people, in one building. Now, in addition, this coalition, through its national members, will form partnerships with other non-Pentecostal evangelical groups, as I said earlier. So, one Southeast Asian apostle, who I won't name, of the Assemblies of God, has a partnership with the Brazil Baptist Convention, which is an affiliate of the US Southern Baptist Convention, and whose program of sports evangelism involves sending Brazilian Baptist missionaries, disguised as football coaches, to difficult, i.e. to Muslim countries, trading on the popularity of Brazilian football players like Cristiano Ronaldo and Pelé. And incidentally, Pelé's wife is a US-trained evangelist, pastor. She sings gospel songs, but she is, let's face it, she is a preacher. And she obviously controls Pelé very well. So the Baptists Brazil Football Center operates in a number of Southeast Asian countries with Pentecostalist connivance. Now, information for this is available, but it's only in Portuguese. And if you do want to find anything whatsoever about the Brazil Football Center's religious aspect, not that it teaches football, that's openly known, everybody knows that. If you want to find anything about the Baptists and the Pentecostalists' involvement in it, you've got to either speak Portuguese or know how to use the Babelfish translation device on your computer. Because there's no mention in English and there's no mention in any other Southeast Asian language. Now, in this part of the world, there are 13 apostles, and there is one member of the inner sanctum. And these 14 pastor the largest and the most well-funded churches in Southeast Asia, Bethany and Surabaya, for example. Most of them are Chinese and one is Indian. All are anti-Muslim and Christian Zionist. I mentioned C. Peter Wagner. He's one of the most important theologians of the Pentecostal charismatic movement. For many years he was a professor of church growth in Fuller Seminary. He founded the Global Harvest Ministries, he founded the World Prayer Center, he founded the Wagner Leadership Institute. And in 2005, Wagner described his mission as follows, and bear with me while I just read something. It's worth hearing in as full as possible. God has chosen to entrust the most challenging assignment Global Harvest has ever had. And bear in mind, this man is second only to God and is able to communicate with a potential of sort of 600 million Christians, many in Southeast Asia. God has chosen to entrust the most challenging assignment Global Harvest has ever had. The Muslim peoples of the world, starting with the 15 nations of the Arab Middle East. Our sphere also includes the non-Arab Middle East, the Muslim regions outside, the Muslim nations outside the Middle East, and the Muslim diaspora. God wants us to start governmentally, connecting with the apostles of the region. Once we have the apostles in place, we will bring the intercessors and the prophets into the inner circle. Now, in the ICA, there are basically three categories of member. There's the apostle, there's the intercessor, and there's the prophet. and all fulfill a particular divine function. One is concerned with receiving messages from God and transmitting them. Another is concerned with acting on them. The prophet receives the messages. The apostle transmits the message, and so on. I mean, it's a quite elaborate structure, which, as an ordinary geography lecturer, I really don't understand fully. I certainly don't understand a lot of the scripture, but certainly it's very deliberate. So once we have the apostles in place, we will bring the intercessors and the prophets into the inner circle, and we will end up with the spiritual core we need for retaking the dominion that is rightfully ours. We launch out into these new territories with the apostolic prophetic government of the church. We will depend heavily on workplace leaders, not just traditional church people. In other words, we are going to go to the sectors of influence such as commerce, finance, banking, journalism, university, and so on. Workplace. We're not going to go to the Christians so much as going to where people work. So Wagner's dominionism relies heavily on spiritual warfare. And in Pentecostal, and certainly in Assemblies of God theology, there is no room for coexistence. Christ's Great Commission dictates that Islam must be destroyed and its territories occupied. And the reason is simple. Allah is Satan. Muslims are devil worshippers. In the words of C. Peter Wagner, and I quote, Allah is a high-ranking demonic spirit who has come to steal, to kill, and to destroy. Those who do not believe in Jesus, including those who worship Allah, are destined to spend eternity in hell. Worship of Allah, no matter how sincere or pure-hearted, will not get a person to heaven any more than will worship of Inti or Amaterasu or Mikali, I'm sorry I got that wrong, or Quetzalcoatl or Kali, or whatever one's created demonic spirit of choice might be. What does God think of those who choose to worship Allah? It makes God mad. Romans 1:18-32 says that the wrath of God is revealed against those who exchange the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. If we keep these things in mind, we will not fall into the trap of being so politically correct in the visible world that we begin to imagine that Muslims are such good people that they are no longer have to be evangelized. Our specialty is prayer warfare, the kind of strategic prophetic intercession that attempts to neutralize the forces of darkness, orchestrated by the God of this age to keep people blinded to the gospel. Specifically, our desire is to see Muslims move from under the power of Allah to God. Now, Wagner's theology, if you can call it that, is worth quoting in length because it underpins a large part of the Pentecostalist global network. And it has a particularly significant effect on relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in regions like Southeast Asia. And evangelicals, including Baptists, generally do not bother to evangelize Muslims. Instead, it is far more productive strategically to target non-Muslims. And this is done through the prosperity gospel, among other things, and through appeals to a people who, like biblical Israel, are surrounded by the devil's army. And in the countries of Southeast Asia, the ICA has a special way of empowering the faithful. Messages from God himself are communicated through senior apostles, not only C. Peter Wagner and Chuck Pierce, but people like Cindy Jacobs, Barbara Wentrobel, and so on, who come to the countries in this region and who then transmit these messages either in their own meetings or in meetings to the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship and so on. These messages, in essence, are a reassurance of God's love for a chosen people trapped by the devil. Now, this is an example of the sort of political potency of spiritual warfare. It sounds quite meek and mild. We're only fighting with prayer. What you have to look at is the content of the prayer, and you have to look at the context in which the prayer is delivered. And in this case, geopolitically, it's a toxic and extremely potent message. So, to make a few points now, finally, about what possibly can be done. And I've got a number of points which I think we can go to. Firstly, if I could just summarize the effects that we're talking about. What are the effects of this kind of network and all these forms of agencies working together and directing a strategy which is in many ways the sort of spiritual manifestation of the secular forces pushing in imperial expansion, corporate development of economies and things like this. Firstly then, there's cultural destruction. Now, quite clearly, evangelization is a form of cultural warfare. As I said earlier, as religion is central to any culture, an attack on religion must be an attack on the wider culture. And this is especially the case in tribal societies, peasant societies, and also in Muslim societies, possibly to a lesser extent than certainly tribal societies. Secondly, ethnic and religious conflict. Where you get the evangelization of minorities, non-Christian religions are usually demonized. And when I use the word demonized, I use it literally. They're actually targeted as part of spiritual warfare, and they are given demonic traits. So conflict is increased, often deliberately, between the converts and wider society, the non-convert society. And this is especially the case in countries with large Muslim populations, where non-Muslim elements are deliberately targeted. They're deliberately targeted and they're deliberately alienated from their Muslim neighbors. And I think this is one of the most worrying things. Thirdly, evangelization strengthens foreign influence over economic and political life. Well, it may be, as in Zambia or in Central America, push to greater IMF control, things like that. It may be the ideology of economic development or whatever, but there are a number of ways foreign influence is strengthened. And thirdly, in wider strategic terms, evangelization is a crucial element of Western aims, and especially US and Israeli aims of managing the world. And I think in this case, the validizing of Zionism is an important aspect of the geopolitical situation. So implications for strategy. Firstly, above all perhaps, we should press the Christian church, and especially the Protestant Christian church, to accept ownership of its militant evangelicals. Now, too often, moderate or liberal Christians seek to dismiss such people as being fringe or unimportant. They're neither. In global terms, politically, economically, culturally, they're extremely dangerous. And in many strategic parts of the world, they've played a very major role in war, in genocide, in civil collapse. And all this they justify in biblical terms. So it's primarily, I think, up to Christians not to disown such people, but to take them on and transform the church as a whole, much as Muslims are expected to do. Secondly, as evangelization is strongly directed towards women and children and towards the sick and the vulnerable, especially refugee victims of conflict and disaster, a case can be made for challenging Western women's groups and human rights groups like Amnesty to highlight the massive abuse of human rights that evangelization involves. Thirdly, there needs to be far clearer awareness of the detailed interconnections between the Christian and the secular. This is something which you can get to by, to put it very crudely, by Googling. And Googling and Googling and Googling until eventually you find what you're looking for. To take an example, I only found out that World Vision was a sister organization of the Fellowship Foundation when I picked up a footnote in Wikipedia, and that footnote led me to the Internal Revenue annual statement of the Fellowship Foundation. IRS, is it? The IRS annual submission of the Fellowship Foundation. And there, on something like, and you had to trawl through every page of something like 40, I don't know, 30, 40 pages. And on the last page, there is a mention, World Vision, sister organization. And I have to admit, I hadn't even been looking for it. So sometimes you can uncover the evidence by an awful lot of hard work and sometimes only by luck. So it's possible then to plot all these networks of interactions and interrelationships. And it can be done. I mean, I could do it with the material that I've collected for this book. And I could do it for, say, Youth with a Mission or other groups like that. And it'd be interesting, incidentally, to do the same thing for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. Fourthly, pressure should, I think, be put on universities and colleges and other official bodies to stop using the soft fronts of known evangelicals in their academic publications, in their strategic planning, and their management advice. For example, John Calvin Maxwell, the author of the 360-degree leader, I think, or something like that, John Calvin Maxwell is used as a management authority by some of the region's state universities. And in doing so, they give credence to a man who is surreptitiously seeking to create 1 million Christian leaders under his Equipping Asian Leaders agency by 2015. And a man who I have on video in answer to a question, where did you get your inspiration for writing all your leadership theories, all your leadership studies? And he's written about 50 or 60 books on leadership and management. And he paused. He was in a Christian, I think it was Concordia University in the US. He paused and he looked at the question and he said, well, if I tell you, please, that's the end of it. I don't want to have to answer this question again. I get all my material from the Bible. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with getting all your material from the Bible. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that people like John Calvin Maxwell have an agenda which they do not talk about. And their front is being ostensibly a secular advisor, a secular communicator. Now, if you're going to engage people at that level, you be open with the rest of you. And especially when you're doing this as part of an agency whose quite explicit intention is to groom 1 million Christian leaders in business, in academic life, and so on in the non-Western world. So I think we need to stop giving credibility to people like this. It's very easy to take them on board because they're glib and because they combine Hollywood with religion and capitalism and so on, and they come across very well. And they have a lot of aphorisms, and my God, we love aphorisms. It's a very quick-fire thing. So that, fifthly, the global networks can be challenged at a local level, like the ICA, by requiring local representatives who normally and who publicly subscribe to the national sensitivities of the countries in which they live, to get them to publicly disavow the more extreme views of their global leadership. And in this case, I'm talking about someone like C. Peter Wagner, who has his apostles in various parts of a strategic region like Southeast Asia. Get them to, I've nearly finished, get them to disavow that sort of thinking. Sixthly, perhaps an evangelical intelligence unit could be set up, a bit like Wagner's World Prayer Center, to gather all available intelligence and so on. I don't know. I mean, these are suggestions. I really can't come up with anything specifically sort of targeting the evangelicals, because they're so intertwined with the rest of the challenge, the rest of the work that has to be done to challenge imperialism. So, if I could just end on one point. I heard this morning that Howard Zinn, since 1980, had sold 2 million copies. The most popular paperback book in American history is the book by Rick Warren called The Purpose-Driven Life, and that sold 40 million copies. So we have a hard job to catch up. Thank you very much.